Many things about Washington that's going on in Washington, D.C., none of which I would put in the high mark. But this is definitely a high mark. And this occasion is a high mark. And I want to tell you, I have never been put in a most difficult position between these beautiful children and their instruments where they've been practicing and waiting to perform for you, and I am what stands between them and you. So I promise you my remarks will be briefer than I had thought. This is like a coming home experience. I've been to Missouri more times than I can mention, and probably in all parts of the state for some occasion or reason, and all of which is about promoting this notion of community partnerships. And I might say, as Landon and Steve, convinced about the timing, I knew exactly the timing. It was more close to around 1991. And there was some very early work around the idea of bringing a community together to make something better, which started, I think, around this notion of building strong communities. And so I would say 10 years is at least the mark. But for many of us, it's been longer than that. And I'd like to say that you stand in good company now. That's the good news that I can bring to you from Missouri. The good news is that about a year ago, or actually about 2 years ago, me and a number of my very close friends, Mark Friedman, Jolie Bain Pillsbury, Susan Roberson, and a number of others, sat down and decided to do something that we call an assessment of the evidence of the effectiveness of community partnerships. And there is a report, actually, that's been ready for a year, but for reasons I'll explain later, hasn't seen the light of day. But I'm going to share some of that with you because I think it's good news for you. It's good news to hear that in every state of this union, there is some type of community partnership formed. So you are no longer part of a social experiment by anybody's measure. This is not a novel idea. This is status quo. So you should applaud the fact that you were one of the forerunners of this work. And I applaud you. Whether you hear about me or not, I'm still telling stories about Missouri. It's time for me to get some new stories, I think. But I think it's important to remember that after 10 years of work, I don't know, some of us, we get a little older. We don't work as hard, maybe. We don't fight as tenaciously. And so I think it's my job to continue to remind us all what we were trying to do and why we're trying to get there. So that just in case you want to sit on your laurels of 10 years of experience and 10 years of difference, that you might be challenged by not only the past and the current atmosphere that we have all to applaud, but some of the things I think are happening in the future. That's what my job is, I have the beautiful, I have the opportunity to describe myself, and recently I had an annual review, and the annual review said, what is your job? So my job is to connect the voices of the people, the community, to real life policy, change, and momentum. It is my job to ensure that the regular folk have an impact on the things that matter to them. And it's my job to remind every policymaker that the job that you're doing on behalf of a critical mass of people, so that we can never again make decisions in corners in Jefferson City or Washington, D.C. without remembering or think about the constituents that we work for. I am happy to say that after 10 years that is something that I can say happens and that people value it. It is not an idea that is laying on lead ears anymore. There's more people trying to create partnerships, trying to connect the voices of the community, trying to connect the voices of constituencies to change. And let's not forget, that's what we were trying to do then. We were trying to get state agencies to respond to the people that they served by listening to them in the decision-making process that about how services are delivered, where services are delivered, who delivered the services, but more important, to ask the questions about accountability. We have now created 360 degrees of accountability through community partnerships. What I mean by that is no longer is it okay for decision makers to make decisions in a vacuum in their offices. Good decisions are made when they include the people that will be impacted by those decisions, when they're made based upon the data and information that helps us to make more robust decisions, but mostly because state agencies alone cannot create the environments that we want for our children and our families. Let me say that again. State agencies alone will never create the environment that we want for our children and our families. Strong communities are what we need to build strong families, and strong families are what we need to raise healthy, productive children. The state agency is the catch-you net when something goes awry. The community, the strength of community, and the supporting network of a community is how we build strong communities, how we improve results. Healthy families who do not need state agencies do not go to the state unless they absolutely have to. What we're trying to create and make it the norm is let's build stronger communities, and you are the answer to that. Stronger communities is what it will take to improve results. The state agency has a major role to play in that. And then many years ago, that's where we started. But I am happy to say we've grown in our acknowledgement of the role of the state. Yes, it is an important role and an essential role. And the state agency needs to deliver services in a productive, proactive way. But we have to be that 360-degree accountability. That we hold state agencies responsible, that we hold our partners responsible, that we hold our neighbors responsible for the network of supports that we think will help to build strong communities. So I'll go back to this little review that we did a couple of years ago. And we established something that we call the evidence meter. It was a term that I came up with because we had this dilemma. How do we determine if community partnerships have really made a difference? So we decided to look at the data, and we looked at 800 indicators, which would mean that if a community partnership had 25 indicators, we looked at their 25 indicators. We had to have 3 years of data. The data had to be aligned with an indicator or a result area that the community partnership said they were focused on. And we asked a team of 5 people to separately look at the data and ask 3 questions. Does the data suggest that the indicator is headed in the right direction? Is that indicator turning a curve? And 3, is it bucking the background trend? Bucking the background trend is an important element because what that means is if you are in a neighborhood in St. Louis and you are making a difference at a rate that is greater or lower than the city of St. Louis, that's the background trend. If you're in the state of Missouri and you are looking at your counterparts in other states, the background trend would be the national data. So the idea was not just is this result or indicator improving in the direction, meaning that it's getting better or moving in the direction that we want it to move in, and is it changing the background trend? So we looked at 800 indicators. And of the 800 indicators, the highest score you could get was a 7, meaning that that answer to that question for that indicator was a yes, yes, yes. If you got anything less than that, you went to 6s, 5s, and 4s. The 4 was the cutoff point. that meant that bucking the background trend is what you were doing, which could mean that you could be making progress, but the progress is small and that you're doing better than your background, but you're not necessarily turning the curve or moving in the direction that you think you want to go. Are you following me on this? Okay, heads are nodding, that's a good thing. All right. So the highest score you could give was 7. Of the community partnerships that we looked at, we took the data, 85% of them received a 4 or above, meaning they were bucking the background trend. 45% of them received a 5 or above. That means that at least one indicator, there was conclusive evidence that change was happening in those communities. 36% of them received a 6 or above on the average rate of whether or not they were moving in the right direction. And 36% received a 7. I mean, there was conclusive evidence that improvements were being made. This is good news, people. Now, this is what's important. So you're making a difference. So I said, well, what are the characteristics of those community partnerships that are making these 7s and these 6s? And this is what I think is important information to share. The first element was that they had strong citizen and community participation, meaning that there was no way that they were not operating in a vacuum. There is not 6 people sitting in a room making decisions in a county. Citizens are involved, partners are involved, and that diversity of partnership was evident. That was one of the main characteristics. The other fundamental characteristic was they had sustained leadership. I mean, they had the same leaders for a long period of time, more than 3 years on average, but in most cases, anywhere from 5 to 7 years was a characteristic of those partnerships that were able to make a difference and improve results. They had involved diverse partners. They had business leaders involved. They had nonprofits involved. They were able to create a culture of collaboration where the community came together, and it wasn't important who owned the agenda, but the agenda was owned by a member of that partnership. This is in critical stuff here, folks. The other thing was that most of them were in partnership with government on some level around some indicator. That means that, a lot of partnerships are growing around the country that have no direct relationship with government, meaning that people are getting the news and realizing that they can do stuff on their own without government. That's the good news. But when you want to make an impact on the outcomes that are related to children and families of vulnerable communities, you need to be in partnership with government. That's another critical characteristic. And this was one that I think that many of you will appreciate. Because in my early years, and some of you remember me from the beginning, I was such a rebel rouser with state government. Thank God they still love me on the other end of this. But I was one of those people that was hammering, we got to give the money to the communities. The communities need to have the money in their banks. They need to be able to hold that money and decide what happened to it. What we learned from this review was influence of the money seemed to be a stronger indicator of a successful partnership than actually having the money in their bank accounts. Being able to make decisions about how the money is spent, even when it's in somebody else's pocket, seemed to align more closely with the more successful partnerships. So what does that tell you? That tells me as a researcher that what collaboration is working, that you realize the importance of getting people to listen to you and to carry out the action on behalf of the community, but you don't necessarily have to have that money in your bank account. Now, I think it's good to have money in your bank account, and I think communities should continue to fight to have money in your bank accounts. But the good news is that if you don't have it in your bank account, what you need to be doing is building relationships, because building strong relationships and trust and being in partnership with those who have the money is a good indicator that you might be successful. Now, so back to the reason why this report hasn't received the light of day. That maybe it has to do with my passion for this work, and because I see this as always an answer. But it was the point about causality. It's the nature of community partnerships that work for them to be an inclusive, inviting environment that's open to the community, where you align people and forces to make things happen, where it's not necessarily your agenda but our agenda. And 201 of those that we interviewed about their successfulness, no one would say we did it by ourselves. If I can't say you did it by yourself, I can't attribute causality. And that is my dilemma. Because causality becomes like, how do you create, as a researcher, a document that describes the rich depth of experience that happens when community partnerships work? Think about it. Think about it in your work. So that is the big issue. That's the good news and the bad news. The good news is we have evidence, and the evidence is growing. The bad news is the experiment is working like it was intended to work, that we bring communities and people together around the issues that matter to them and their communities, and that continues to be the good work. Now, to the future, we have to think about ways that we build on this agenda. If you have been working at the same outcomes for the last 10 years, it's time to move forward. If you have been working on the same initiatives for the last 5 years, it's time to think forward. If you have been working around the same issues in your partnership, it's time to move ourselves forward. As I was coming here today, and and many of you who know me say, a funny thing happened to me on my way to Missouri. It always is a funny story about me being on my way to Missouri. I won't bore you with my funny story for today. I'll just say that, let's just say I was in a very teeny plane that only 2 of us could get in, and flying through storms, and I'm thinking, I have to make this matter when I get there. So here's my charge to make this matter. I think that this work is so important and continues to be extremely important that this room should be filled up with 300, 500, 1,000 people listening. How can we make that happen? I am one of those people who would tell communities all the time, you don't need money to make things happen. You need good relationships. You need good voices. You need good people with good intent. I think in this room we have all of that. How can we move this forward? How can we make this matter? How can we let other people hear about the good things that are happening here and in other places, other states who started out this journey 10 years ago? Just because we don't have some major foundation willing to give us money to make that happen is not an excuse. I think that it's time for us to put together the innovative, creative thoughtfulness that's in this room to make sure everyone knows about the good work that's going on here and across this country as it pertains to community partnerships. Community partnerships are now growing to build early care and education, to strengthen families, to build systems of support and child welfare, and to increase foster care homes, to reduce abuse and neglected families and children. There is no end to where this work can go. I hope that if I come back here in the next several years, that we'll be talking about the future. We'll be talking about where we've taken this in 10 years. We won't be talking about an initiative that's had 10 years of wonderful work, but an initiative that has 10 years of wonderful work ahead of it. And I hope that I will be here charging you on as I am tonight. Thank you for listening.